There was a huge amount of print time. Here are some views of the different parts coming together. First, I had to finish cleaning up the pieces. Once they were pretty good, I used some activator on one side and some CA glue on the other side. These lock together immediately when they touch. Overall, most of the seams turned out really nicely, but they weren't all perfectly flat. So to fill in the gaps, I used some Bondo. I found that by putting it on a little bit thicker and then going back with a knife before it completely set up, it was easy to get rid of some of the high spot. I sanded and Bondoed and sanded and Bondoed over and over, and eventually used a tack cloth to get rid of all the dust and then blew it off with an air blower. Then it was time to get the surfaces flat, but instead of just sanding them all, I started out with some filler primer. This fills in some of the area in between the build lines of the 3D print. You can see here where the shapes are still sticking out from the Bondo underneath. I spent the time to get rid of all those details first before working on the overall sanding mass of all the surfaces. To start cleaning up the main surface, I used a fine sanding sponge. After that, I used some flexible 220 sandpaper and just went over everything again. I sanded up to high grits, then removed the dust with a tack cloth, and then added another layer of primer. I also printed out a few detail pieces that needed to be painted black. On these, I just had to really sand the edges to make sure that they would fit into the helmet where they went. After I did a test fit and was happy with them, I just did one coat of primer and then some paint. And it was finally time for full color on the whole helmet. I grabbed a rattle can from the local store that I thought might be the right color, and once I got it sprayed on, it wasn't. I decided just to use it as a base coat instead. So instead, for the final coat, I mixed up some acrylics and just played with the color until I got something that I thought was pretty close to the images that I was looking at. It may be a little bit too yellow, but I think it'll work out. I also got out my cheap airbrush for the first time. I'd never used it before, and it was a really good experience trying to figure out how to use it and apply color. Often airbrushes are used to add details rather than fully covering something, but this was kind of the best way for me to add all of this color. It just took a long time and took several tries. Eventually, I had a really even color that I was happy with. Next, I added the detail pieces using some CA glue. I wasn't sure that CA would be strong enough to hold the visor on since it's pretty large, so I mixed up some 2-part 5-minute epoxy. I smeared quite a bit of the epoxy onto the helmet where I knew it would meet the visor, then positioned the visor and made sure I had it at the right angle. It was actually kind of tough to get it centered and make sure that I had it right, then I just had to hold it in place while the epoxy set up. Next, it was time to add the paint that looked like it would have been there if the helmet was brand new. The black line around the top of the visor was the biggest detail that needed to be painted in, but I wanted to have a clean line on the underside, so I used some masking tape that's made for pinstriping. I put that down there, coated over the whole thing with black, and then pulled off the tape. It ended up with a really nice clean line. I filled in some of the other details on the helmet and then masked off a couple other areas to fill in with black. For the insignia that goes on the visor, I used my vinyl cutter and cut out a little stencil. I used my airbrush to fill this in with red. Now the red didn't go on very well, and to get it nice and opaque, I had to do several coats. I was really happy with how it turned out though. And then it was time for weathering. I used some burnt umber to start with and made a wash with a whole lot of water. I smeared it on with a paper towel and got it really wet, and then went back with a wet paper towel and wiped the majority of it off. I did the same thing with black and actually ended up using a lot more black than burnt umber, and eventually all the cracks and the seams get filled in with this stuff, and it just adds a layer of grime that makes it look like it was used. After I was happy with that, I went back with a chip brush and some black paint and went over the edges to make it look like the paint had been scraped off and there was a black metal underneath. This is a technique that it's really easy to overdo, so I had to stop myself and just call it done. Finally, it was time to make the visor, and to do this I put a piece of paper on the inside and traced the rough shape. This gave me an idea of how big of a piece of plexiglass I needed to cut on the bandsaw. I just cut out a little strip of the thinnest plexiglass I had around and then used a heat gun to start bending it into shape. Once the shape was a pretty good fit, it was time to add the tint. I used a squeegee to get rid of the air bubbles and then used a heat gun to bend the corners of the tint around the corners of the plastic. I fit the lens on the inside of the helmet and held it in its final position. Finally, I masked off the lens and then ran over the whole thing with a couple of coats of matte clear coat to protect the paint. And here it is, completely finished, and I couldn't be happier with it. I am super happy with how this thing turned out, even though it's not 100% screen accurate. As I was assembling it and painting it, I found several things about the model that are not quite right, but overall, I mean, it's a Stormtrooper helmet. It's super cool. Regardless of the imperfections, I love how it came out, and this might be my favorite project that I've ever made. Originally, I only wanted to make the helmet just as a prop, but now I kind of want to make all of the armor pieces as well. I also think projects like this are a really good example of how 3D printing can enhance the stuff that you're making. Rather than just 3D printing something, use it as a step in a larger project. Thanks for watching!
See you next time.